Alright, so picking up where I left off in the last video, we stopped at the Battle of Iwo Jima, going back to the Pacific Front. And Iwo Jima was one of the islands, one of the important islands on the island hopping campaign. It was only 750 miles from Japan itself, and it had a number of airfields that could be very strategically important for future bombings in Japan. It was an incredibly bloody battle for basically a small piece of rock in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, and it lasted for 5 weeks for this small piece of rock. In the fighting, just 4 days into the fighting, Marines raised the American flag on one of the summits, which was called Mount Surabaki. And this image was captured by an Associated Press photographer, Joe Rosenthal, and he won the Pulitzer Prize for the photo. They later restaged the photo when all the fighting had calmed down, and the story of this is recounted in the movie made by Clint Eastwood, Flag of Our Fathers. So that goes into the whole background of this image. And Clint Eastwood also made another film about the same Battle of Iwo Jima, Letters from Iwo Jima, from the Japanese perspective. So it's kind of interesting. He made 2 films at the same time from each of the perspectives, the American perspective and the Japanese perspective. And I recommend actually both films. It's interesting to see the 2 different sides. But anyway, this image, this iconic image of the Marines who are raising the flag, has become the monumental image of the Marine Corps, and it's the Marine Corps War Memorial, which is near Arlington. Unfortunately, when we went to Washington, D.C., we were not able to see it in person up close because the park was under reconstruction. So we kind of saw it from a distance from Arlington National Cemetery. But this bloody, long battle over a piece of rock was very costly for American lives as well as Japanese lives. And the sad thing is at the end of it, really the value of Iwo Jima as a strategic point of action was called into question because it really was never used as a strategic location, a staging location afterwards. So a lot of lives, a lot of blood lost for perhaps a useless island. That brings us to our last major island invasion of the war in the Pacific, which is Okinawa. And this was the bloodiest battle by far in the Pacific. And it was part of a bigger invasion called Operation Iceberg, which was the plan to invade a number of the Ryukyu Islands, including Okinawa. You can see in the map the island of Japan, and just off the southern tip is Okinawa and a number of other small island strips there. Okinawa itself is a pretty large island, and one of the major aspects of this battle was the heavy use of kamikaze suicide pilots on the Navy that was supporting the troops that were landing, and the Home Guard and the civilians that were conscripted. So the advancing American troops, when they talk about this battle, they often say they couldn't tell the difference between a Japanese soldier and a civilian who was armed or who was using themselves as a suicide bomber. And so there was a very unclear line drawn between civilians and military at this point. Mostly because this was one of the last strongholds before the Allies make it to Japan itself. So this was the last stand of the Japanese to hold the Americans off from the mainland, off from their mother country. And so they were willing to fight at all costs to the end, to the last, in order to prevent the American advancement. The Americans end up suffering about 50,000 casualties, and the Japanese over 110,000 estimated, but these are vague estimates, especially when you're considering the number of possible civilian casualties as well. So the winning of this battle by the Allies was very crucial because, like I said, it's the last stopping point before getting to Japan. I put down at the bottom a little note about the fact that Hacksaw Ridge, in the film Hacksaw Ridge, which I think most of you have seen, that talks about Corporal Desmond Doss, who is a conscientious objector. This takes place in the invasion of Okinawa. So Hacksaw Ridge is a part of that island, and he ends up winning the Medal of Honor for his bravery, as you know from the film. So this is the last main island that they're taking over, and the next one will basically be heading into the islands of Japan itself. But before this happens, as you well know, first we have victory declared in Europe. So this changes the tide of the war in the Pacific as well, because now America does not have to continue fighting a two-front war. So the Allies finally overrun Germany. Germany is crushed between the Soviet forces advancing from the east and British, French, and American allies from the west. And on the 25th of April, 1945, the two sides meet in the middle of the Elbe River in Germany. And 5 days later, Hitler commits suicide after killing his wife and dog, and a number of the other high-level German officials also commit suicide before being taken by the Allied powers. And then on the 7th of May, the Germans signed the unconditional surrender, and on the 8th of May at 11 p.m. It takes effect. So all hostilities in Europe come to an end, and all of Germany surrenders. So now the Germans end up being divided essentially by the Soviet forces, and we're predisposed here in Europe to set up the stage for the Cold War, which will take place after the end of World War II between the United States and the Soviet forces. So after 6 years and millions of lives lost, the Nazi Third Reich is defeated. Yeah, exactly. This gives a kind of a quick picture as how Europe is left at the end of the war. Obviously, cities are completely destroyed everywhere, from the carpet bombing from both sides, Allies and Axis powers. You can see here in this picture, it's pretty impressive. It almost looks like a lunar surface with all of the bomb craters in the ground all over the place, and rubble. And so the people in Europe are having to reconstruct. And if you think about it, sure, in Europe about 20 million people are killed in the war itself, and not to mention the 6 million who are killed in the extermination camps, etc. But think about the fact that all of these countries, Austria, Czechoslovakia, Albania, Poland, Finland, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg, France, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, Greece, Yugoslavia, and the Soviet Union, Italy, and Germany, have all been fought over, and most of them have been fought over twice. So that means bombings, that means destruction, exportation of peoples, fleeing, exiles from their countries. It's their entire infrastructure, their industry, their ports. I mean, Europe is in ruins at her knees. Economically speaking, just physically speaking, it's just been completely destroyed. So this is how Europe is looking after the war. Now, in Japan, on December 28th, 1942, FDR had authorized the formation of the Manhattan Project, which is basically the project for nuclear development. And the team worked in the deserts of New Mexico to put together a theoretical potential weapon of mass destruction using this nuclear research. And Robert Oppenheimer was the father of the atomic bomb, and later he got off the project, but he's the one that actually put together the two atomic bombs that were then later used in Japan. One was called the Little Boy, and he was a uranium-based bomb, and the other one was the Fat Man, and he was plutonium-based bomb. So there's two types that they created. And in late July of 1945, President Truman, who had taken over after the death of FDR, called for Japan's surrender in the Potsdam Declaration. So they declared Japan must unconditionally surrender, and if not, that they should expect a prompt and utter destruction. Of course, Japan is not understanding this threat as being a threat of an atomic bomb. They don't know that the United States has this capacity. No one has this capacity. And so they're thinking of an invasion of the mainland, just like the Americans had been doing from island to island. And obviously, they are a prideful people, and they will not surrender. They have fought so hard, they are going to fight to the end. Last woman, man, woman, and child. So this is their mentality. They're not ready to give up. The United States obviously had a different viewpoint. The U.S. had already seen the bloodshed and the difficulties of advancing from island to island, and the thousands and hundreds of thousands of American lives that were being lost with every little island that was being taken. And these obviously were not islands of mainland Japan. These were almost, you could say, insignificant posts in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And so the prospect of actually invading Japan and their islands, their mother islands, was predicted to have a death toll on the American military, an astronomical death toll. With this consideration, Harry Truman felt that the strategic bombing of cities with first Hiroshima with an industrial and military target would be the quickest way of ending the war with the least loss of American lives. And so on August 6th, 1945, the Enola Gay, which is the name of the airplane, a B-29 bomber, set off for Hiroshima and dropped the Little Boy, killing about 80,000 people on impact. Then, because Japan did not surrender, the United States headed to another industrial location, but because of bad weather, they turned to their secondary target of Nagasaki, and they dropped the Fat Man, killing about 40,000 people on impact. Obviously, some people estimate even hundreds of thousands of others died later from radiation exposure because of both of these bombs. So the deaths on impact was only a fraction of the damage done in Japan. With these two bombs, the emperor, Hirohito, was not going to see his people suffer anymore, and he saw that the Allies had a potential weapon that could completely wipe out Japan from the face of the earth, essentially. And they didn't know how many bombs America had. they didn't know that at the moment America had only developed these 2 bombs. And so they were expecting that the Allies would have more of these bombs and could keep on bombing city after city, obliterating all the cities of Japan. And if the next city was Tokyo. So Hirohito decided to surrender. And there was an attempted military coup, but unsuccessful. And finally, the emperor broadcasted his capitulation to the Americans. Truman then announced Japan's surrender, and the VJ Day, or Victory over Japan, is celebrated on August 15th, the day after Hirohito broadcasted his surrender. Then on September 2nd, the Allied powers entered Tokyo Bay, and with the USS Missouri, the battleship USS Missouri, they invited the delegation from Japan on board to sign the surrender of the Empire of Japan. So that ended officially World War II on both fronts. After such a bloody and terrible war on both fronts that included heinous crimes against humanity, it was necessary that those who had not followed conducts of war that are internationally recognized should go on trial and pay for their war crimes, if you will. As I had mentioned before, there were many circumstances and things that happened in World War II on both sides that were questionable with regard to genocide, civilian atrocities, crimes against humanity. However, certain things stand out. You know, there's the carpet bombing, but then there's the torture and the inhumane existence of concentration camps. These are two different realities, and they need to be treated as such. So in Europe, they held a series of trials called the Nuremberg trials, from the place where they were held in Germany, from 1945 until 1949. And most high party, Nazi party officials and military officers were tried here, and with a bureau of judges from the different allied nations, they tried to come to the truth of who was actually guilty of crimes of genocide and other crimes against humanity. These trials end up leading to the formation of the International Tribunal and the United Nations Genocide Convention and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So it's kind of the forerunner to all of these international organizational agreements and treaties and recognition of certain crimes of genocide and crimes against humanity as being unacceptable on a worldwide basis. The same kind of thing happens in Japan. The International Military Tribunal, which is predominantly run by the United States in this case, again, they tried the high officials and government officials and military officials for crimes against humanity and war crimes. And a number of them were executed. Most of them were then, or otherwise, imprisoned for life. Emperor Hirohito was not tried. The United States recognized that he had a value as a symbol of Japan for Japanese unity and conservatism, and they wanted to preserve his position. He was held in high regard by the Japanese, almost as a god, and they didn't want to touch him for this purpose. They wanted him to be a voice in favor of reconstruction and unity and peace with other nations, because they saw that he had this capability. So what happens after World War II? When World War I ended you remember that the situation was pretty bitter. The winning powers wanted to punish, especially Germany, but the Central Powers, and they wanted them to pay. They wanted revenge. And they carved up Europe, and they redesigned the map of Europe, and they humiliated Germany, and they made Germany pay back retributions, which they wouldn't be able to pay anyway. And they basically set the stage for a Second World War, like we had said. After World War II, the situation was very different. World War I, America with Wilson had given their suggestions, Wilson's 14 points. They were very idealistic, if you remember. But he wanted these points. Why? To create a peace, a lasting peace that would not lead to a Second World War. Well, after the Second World War, because of the really important role that the United States played in winning the war, the United States had a much greater voice in the types of peaces that were established both in Europe and in the Pacific. And it was very different than World War I. In Europe, the United States set up what we call the Marshall Plan. It's also known as the European Recovery Program. Essentially, it was a program where the United States sent over aid and money and support, economic and financial and industrial support, to help get the countries of Europe back on their feet, to help rebuild their cities, their industries, their infrastructure, their economies, and get them back on their feet so that they could be trading partners again, and really their futures were interconnected. And so a stronger Europe meant a stronger United States, and the U.S. tried to get Europe back on its feet. This is incredible because the United States sent aid not only to their allies, for example, England and France, where the majority of aid went, but they also sent aid to Germany to put Germany back on its feet. They sent aid to all the countries in Europe that had been involved in the conflict. And they sent aid to Italy, right, who in the end, at the end of the war, was on the Allied side. For the majority of the war, they hadn't been. So this indiscriminate help given to all the countries in Europe really helped create a sense of solidarity, and let's put this all behind us and let's all get back up on our feet and start over again with a different spirit. And this is the kind of spirit that helps create a society that's not then going to turn to what could have been a third world war, right? So this spirit of reconstruction, both of the allies and of the enemies, was very different than the spirit that we had seen after World War I. And the fruits can be seen today. If you think about the European Union, the United Nations that was developed after World War II, and the role and the situation between the United States and Europe today, right? The same thing happens in Japan. In September of 1945, General Douglas MacArthur, who was the main military leader in the Pacific, there was Nimitz, who was the naval leader, but MacArthur was the army leader. He took charge of the Supreme Command of Allied Powers, called SCAP, which was in charge of rebuilding Japan. And again, we have the same kind of thing where we have American aid going to Japan to help put Japan back on its feet as an industrial power, as an economic power, and as a nation. So there wasn't the humiliating and demands for retributions to be paid, etc. They had a three-stage plan to put Japan back on its feet. The first one, they imposed a new constitution. So you can say, well, that's not very democratic, but
the new constitution was in the best interests of Japan, and it was for the better of Japan. The negative thing for the Japanese people was that it degraded the emperor to a figurehead status instead of being the top political commander. But otherwise, it increased the parliamentary system's power and promoted rights for women, etc., that obviously were not recognized in Japan at this time. And it also imposed the fact that Japan could not be able to wage war, so their defenses had to be very limited. That, I think, can be completely understood under the circumstances. The second stage, however, was the rebuilding of the Japanese economy, putting them back on their feet. Also trying to make them a strong economy so as to not open the door to communist infiltration, right? So this is a moment in which America and the Soviet Union are going to be entering into a conflict, although unbloody, a conflict over ideologies. And so Japan is put back on its feet economically, and their industry is back and running, and natural resources that they lacked are found, and they become strong trading partners with the rest of the world. Then their third stage was that the United States would be able to maintain bases in the area, including in Okinawa and other places in Japan, and that the United States would make Japan a protectorate. There was a bilateral security pact. What does that mean? Japan cannot have a huge army that would be able to go on the offensive, but they can have their defense force, and if anybody attacked Japan, the United States would be their ally, and they would defend Japan. Now think about this for a second. Japan was our sworn enemy. We said to Japan, we don't want you to be able to wage war against us again. We're going to take away your gun. But we're not going to leave you defenseless. We're not going to leave you vulnerable. If anybody comes and attacks you, Japan, we will defend you. We will protect you. Don't worry. Now, that certainly was not the attitude after World War I. And think about the history. Japan has become one of the world powers in economics, and Japan has ever since World War II been a friend to the United States. So instead of creating a Germany and a Japan who would swear revenge because of the humiliation or the destruction that they suffered, morally or physically, after World War II, both nations, both Germany and Japan, were rebuilt and put back on their feet and given independence once again. And so today, what do we find? We find a strong Germany and a strong Japan, but both committed to working on the globe for world peace and free trade and partners in the UN, and essentially we didn't set the stage for a World War III. So that's a big difference between the ending of World War I and the ending of World War II. And at the end of the slideshow, I put the other half of the timeline, so it kind of gives you the perspective of all the events. So you can look at that. That kind of helps orient you. And then here at the end, I just showed you the episodes on Netflix, which I had wanted you guys to watch. So that's episode 10, 11, 12, and 13. So that's it for World War II in brief. And I'll see you later for the Cold War. Bye, my dears.